Hi there, and welcome to Oakland Side 510. I'm Tasneem Raja, editor-in-chief of the Oakland Side, Oakland's independent nonprofit newsroom. If you've lived in Oakland for any length of time, you've probably heard, at one point or another, that our city is in a budget crisis, a fiscal cliff, an emergency. Maybe it's a warning that firehouses will close, or that police academies will be canceled, or that the city is staring down the biggest deficit in its history. The word bankruptcy even gets bandied about from time to time. And then a few months pass. A ballot measure fails or a one-time deal falls through, but somehow the lights stay on. Some things even get better. For better and worse, life goes on. But we all know life goes on isn't the whole story, and that is what we want to sit with today. Why does Oakland lurch from budget crisis to budget crisis? Are the warnings real, or are our leaders crying wolf? That's what we are discussing in today's episode. But first, a word from a local sponsor. Every day, real people with real stories take BART to the places they need to go and the things they love to do. From doctor's appointments and visits with friends to adventures and fun across the Bay Area. BART highlights riders in a series called BART Connects, whose stories span generations, neighborhoods, and walks of life, including a Grammy-winning musician, a local fisherman, and a senior who rides BART to visit a friend of more than 70 years. Their stories are a reminder that BART is more than a transit system. It's a connection to the people and places that matter most. Maybe it's time you give BART a try. Visit bit.ly/BART Connects to meet these and other riders and BART.gov/planner to plan your next trip. BART, let's go. Okay, back to our main story today. To help me work through these questions about Oakland's seemingly never-ending financial roller coaster, I'm joined by two of our City Hall reporters. Eli Wolfe covers City Hall and has reported on every budget cycle over the last few years. And Natalie Orenstein covers housing and City Hall and has spent a lot of time talking to people who feel these cuts most acutely. Eli, Natalie, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Tasneem.
Thanks.
Okay, Eli, let me start with the big confusion about Oakland's financial problems. It really can feel like the same crisis on repeat. Is it the same crisis, or is it actually a new one each time?
It's mostly the same one wearing different clothes. So underneath all of this is something that city officials call a structural deficit. And the plain meaning of that is Oakland spends more money than it brings in year after year. This isn't new, and it's not a secret. The city's own long-range forecasts have projected big gaps in the general fund going back to at least 2020. So when you hear people say there's nothing, quote-unquote, unanticipated about these emergencies, they have a point. The shortfalls are, in a sense, baked in.
So if it's structural, what is driving that? Why does Oakland keep coming up short?
A big one is how Oakland makes its money. The city leans heavily on a tax it collects whenever property changes hands. It's called the real estate transfer tax. When interest rates rise and home and building sales slow down, or nice buildings that used to be very expensive to buy start selling for way less money, that revenue stream dries up fast. So in recent years, the real estate transfer tax came in millions of dollars below what the city was banking on. Oakland also counts on taxes from hotel stays and business travel, and a lot of those travelers just haven't come back since the pandemic.
Right.
And then, of course, the federal COVID relief money that propped up the budget for a couple of years ran out in 2023. So the underlying problem got exposed.
Just not enough revenues. Okay, so what about the spending side?
So on the spending side, the dominant item is public safety. By the city's own accounting, somewhere around 3/4 of the money that Oakland has the most flexibility to use goes to police and fire. Most of that is salaries and benefits. Dan Lindheim, a former city administrator who teaches public policy at UC Berkeley, put it bluntly to us. He said, if you're not willing to seriously touch police and fire, it's very hard to find real savings in the general fund. And a big issue that crops up each year related to that is that OPD overspends its budget on overtime by millions and millions of dollars.
Right.
So historically, the city has been very reluctant to cut police and fire spending. On the police side, that's because the city has a high rate of crime and residents want police services.
Sure.
On the fire side, the city's older housing stock is a constant danger, and then there's the wildfire threat that looms over Oakland. So every time the city goes looking for cuts, it runs into that wall. And because that wall is so hard to move, the cuts tend to get pushed elsewhere onto smaller programs and the people who depend on them.
We'll certainly get back to that. If police and fire are the big ticket items, but they're also the hardest ones to cut back on, Natalie, what options does the city have?
Yeah, well, over the last few years, we've seen the city turn to one-time fixes, basically quick infusions of large amounts of cash that can prop things up for another budget cycle or two, but they don't fix the underlying gaps in the long term. Eli mentioned one example, the federal COVID relief money. There's another one that comes up often in the news, the Coliseum and the city's desire to sell its share of the property.
Right. Can you just remind us, what that's all about?
Yeah, well, in 2024, the city built a budget that assumed that the Coliseum would be sold and would bring in well over $100 million to Oakland. But the deal kept getting delayed. In fact, it still hasn't closed. So you had a budget that looked balanced on paper, then the money didn't show up, and the council had to go back and make emergency cuts to make up for it. In theory, Oakland has fiscal policies that guide how the city budgets for stuff, including guidance about not relying on one-time revenues to cover ongoing expenditures. Obviously, the city has been ignoring that at times. And these Band-Aid solutions or attempted solutions are a big reason for the whiplash that residents feel. The crisis isn't always actually a brand new problem. Sometimes it's the same emergency as last time because the rescue plan was a one-time Band-Aid that didn't pan out.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. That is really helpful. I want to talk more about that word, emergency, right? Residents, you'll often hear people just venting about the fact that the city formally declares a kind of fiscal emergency on a regular basis. So, Eli, what is that? What is a fiscal emergency?
So there is a real mechanism here, an official definition, and this is where I want to be careful about what it is and isn't. So take Measure NN. That was a new tax that voters approved in 2024, in part because they were told it would increase the minimum number of police officers working in Oakland to 700. But Measure NN also gave the city an out. In the event that it still couldn't afford to get to 700 officers, the city could keep charging residents the new tax, but declare extreme fiscal necessity to get out from under the 700 requirement.
Okay, I want to make sure I have this right. Basically, people agreed to be taxed more in return for certain promises, but then they saw the city play what felt to some people like a get-out-of-jail-free card in the form of declaring an extreme fiscal necessity and not have to fulfill those promises. Is that basically it?
Yeah, that's right. And some residents argue the city uses these emergency declarations more broadly than that to free up dedicated tax money for more general operating costs.
Okay. So at the heart of this, what I want to understand is, if you declare an emergency, seemingly every year, is it really an emergency?
That's exactly the tension. And the city has actually gotten tangled in that question itself. So back in late 2024, we reported that Oakland accidentally published a draft report that used the words Chapter 9, which is the part of the federal law that deals with the city going bankrupt. So the draft warned the city had to act immediately to stay solvent. City officials scrambled to pull it down and swap in a version without that language. They said that the bankruptcy talk was premature. The council president at the time texted us, essentially, what the heck is going on with this article? And another council member had earlier warned her colleagues about throwing around, in her words, the B word when it isn't substantiated.
So the city itself doesn't want to say that scary word out loud.
Right. Officials are very careful in public because alarming language can spook the investors and creditors that the city borrows from. So you get this strange dynamic, right? Dire warnings in one breath, reassurance in the next.
That's really helpful. Eli, can you just say a little bit more about that, this relationship with investors and creditors and sort of why the city's fiscal image matters?
Yeah. Oakland, like basically all municipalities relies on investors from outside the city to get a lot of stuff done. So, we pave our roads because we're able to sell bonds to investors, and that raises tens of millions of dollars for us. So those investors want to invest with us if we're a good investment opportunity.
Yeah.
When they're doing their analysis to see whether they should spend money on Oakland, they are looking at our books and seeing, okay, is the city balancing its books every year? Is it spending wisely? Is it running into shortfalls? And, one of the words that I think is probably a major red flag for all of them is bankruptcy.
Yeah. This happens in the private sector too. Oakland's private housing developers have really slowed down construction in recent years, and they blame a lot of it on this negative image of Oakland in national headlines that make investors from, say, New York or China run away from pouring money into a city that's seen as struggling from the outside.
Mm. And so the image that you want to portray to, Chinese investors, say, or Wall Street bond holders is going to be different at times from the language you're going to hear in a campaign to raise a new parcel tax, right? So both of these kind of depends on what someone's incentives are, what their motivations are. While we're on the subject of definitions, Eli, I would love for you to define another term that comes up a lot when we're talking about Oakland's finances, fiscal cliff. What is a fiscal cliff?
Oakland is legally required to balance its books by the end of each fiscal year, meaning the budget for the year ahead cannot show that the city is spending more money than it brings in. That's what a balanced budget means.
Mm-hmm.
If the city can't figure out a balanced budget plan for the coming year, that can trigger serious legal and fiscal consequences. So I don't know if this is necessarily a hard definition, but when you hear people talking about a fiscal cliff, that's the cliff that city staffers are terrified of tipping over.
Okay, got it. So some of these terms get thrown around in everyday conversation, like fiscal cliff, but sometimes they can also have an official or technical or legal definition.
Right.
And that can get confusing.
Right again.
Okay. So let's keep talking about the possible tools that the city has in its toolkit to fix the structural deficit, to stay balanced, beyond these one-time or Band-Aid solutions that you guys have been talking about. Now, Natalie, speaking of Measure NN, the city has repeatedly leaned on voters to pass new taxes to fill its revenue gaps.
Yeah, the 2025 budget, for instance, banked on voters approving a sales tax that would bring in roughly $20 million a year. That measure passed, and it eased the city's structural deficit a little.
Mm-hmm.
The city tried to do a similar thing this year with a parcel tax, Measure E, which would have brought in about $34 million a year. The mayor, the council, and city unions all campaigned pretty hard for it.
Mm-hmm.
Supporters argued that this money was genuinely needed to keep core services staffed. Mayor Lee wrote a whole spending plan for this measure that would have kicked in on top of her base budget proposal to show voters how she planned to dish out Measure E money on fire and police vehicles, on more police officer jobs, illegal dumping cleanups, other good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Critics included the real estate industry and some accountability groups. They argue that it would be another burden on homeowners with no guarantee that residents would get what they were promised. In the end, voters turned down Measure E a few weeks ago.
Now, going into the June election, Mayor Lee had plans for what would happen in both scenarios. Whether Measure E passed or didn't pass, she laid out what the budget might look like.
Right. Basically, the city had learned its lesson from banking on the Coliseum sale in 2024. So they knew they had to balance the budget without banking on the parcel tax money. And even without Measure E factored in, the budget avoided the worst case scenarios. There were no layoffs. It keeps fire services and the ceasefire violence prevention program. It maintained homelessness services, and it even restored a few things, an extra day at senior centers, faster illegal dumping cleanups, added security at a couple of library branches.
See, this is just exactly the kind of whiplash that I think can really confuse and frustrate residents. On the one hand, the campaigning around Measure E suggested that, without this new tax, Oakland would be in really bad shape. And yet, when the tax failed, a lot of this stuff stayed in the budget anyway, and we didn't see things contract. We actually saw some new things get added. How?
Yeah, I asked the finance director this, and he described the work of creating a balanced budget without Measure E as, quote, dimes and couch cushions kind of work, basically going line by line, constraining spending to what they could actually afford in really nitty-gritty cases. They also cut a bunch of vacant positions. These are jobs they had budgeted for but never hired someone into.
Right. These vacant positions, can you guys just talk a little bit more about like how that factors into the budget?
Yeah, the vacant positions are like a layer of financial fat that the city carries around all the time. There's something like 700, 800 jobs that the city has money for, but for one reason or another, they haven't hired the staff to fill those jobs.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it's very frustrating for residents who want more people out cleaning the street or, putting out fires. On the other hand, that's money that the city can basically cannibalize for other things that it wants to spend money on. So some of the stuff that Natalie mentioned probably is only getting funded because the city has these vacant jobs that are like little pots of cash that it can draw on during the budget season.
Right. And that helps explain how this huge gap that Measure E was supposed to fill, that was supposed to be, devastating, just got managed.
Yeah, for now at least. And that's the pattern that might be making residents skeptical. They hear warnings of devastation, but then they watch the city find the money in the proverbial couch cushions.
Yeah.
So when they're then asked to approve a new tax to prevent the devastation, some of them say, wait, didn't you just tell me you could manage without it?
Yeah, and we've seen versions of this across lots of different kinds of work that the city does. One good recent example had to do with arts funding. In the 2025 budget, the council eliminated the city's top arts position, the cultural affairs manager. There was a ton of outcry over this, and our colleague Azucena Recia did some great reporting on it. Artists came to City Hall to plead for the position not to be cut, and eventually the cultural affairs job was restored. So that fight is a good example of one of the dynamics that residents probably find confusing. Something will get cut, there's a big public outcry, and then sometimes it quietly comes back.
Yeah. Let me just ask you both the cynical question directly, because we know a lot of Oaklanders are asking it. Is the city crying wolf to get tax money, or is the danger real?
I think the fairest answer is that both things are true at once, and that's genuinely hard to hold in your head. So the structural deficit is definitely real. The forecasts are real. The cuts that hit community groups and city workers are real. Services have, in fact, been cut. But it's also true that the apocalyptic framing rarely fully materializes, partly because the city keeps finding these short-term fixes. And while Oakland's finances aren't excellent, some parts of the city's tax base are pretty robust. So there's lots of expensive real estate here, homes, industrial and commercial properties, land that's valued in the billions of dollars. And there's other significant sources of tax revenue that consistently generate millions of dollars every year for the city.
Right. I think the honest answer is that the fiscal emergency is real, but it usually doesn't land on the city as a whole. It lands on specific people and specific programs out at the edges. The core machine of the city keeps running, not perfectly by any means, but running. The most tangible, obvious cuts tend to fall on the margins.
Give us some examples.
So it's important to understand that the city gives a lot of money each year to community organizations that provide an astonishingly wide range of services to incredibly diverse populations across the city.
Right.
These are nonprofit groups doing violence prevention work, delivering meals to seniors, providing legal help to tenants, running youth programs, much, much more. The city essentially hires them as contractors to do this work. So in early 2025, the city abruptly cut millions of dollars in funding from more than a dozen such community organizations mid-contract to help close a shortfall of nearly $130 million after the Coliseum deal didn't pan out. Also in 2025, my colleague Rosalind Romero reported the city quietly eliminated its neighborhood services division, which connected residents to City Hall on everyday safety problems. Rosen's piece really brought to life how important that division had been in creating a sense of community and just a sense of where to turn in some Oakland neighborhoods that have more problems with crime. When people talk about wanting to see less crime in Oakland, they may not even know that programs like this exist and that the city is either running them or funding them. And so when they disappear, fewer people notice.
Mm-hmm. We'll link to Rosalind's piece in the show notes. What you're saying is the city survives, but the safety net frays.
Yeah, and that's the trade-off that often gets lost in the headline numbers. When officials say no layoffs or services restored, that can be true for the city's core operations, but at the same time, a nonprofit loses a contract it was counting on, and the people that the nonprofit serves lose meals or shelter or mental health access for their kids or free and easy transportation to doctor's appointments.
Mm-hmm. I do want to complicate this picture a little, though, because, if you've been picturing the people who feel all of this as only as Oakland's poorest residents, we know that's not the whole story either. Plenty of Oakland residents who aren't afraid of losing their homes or aren't struggling to put food on the table, have lots to say about ways that they feel failed by the city.
Right. I mean, the most acute harm, losing a neighborhood safety ambassador, losing a meal program, does tend to fall on the communities with the smallest cushion.
Yeah.
But frustration with the city runs across the income spectrum. It just shows up differently, perhaps.
Yeah.
A lot of better off Oaklanders aren't worried about a given nonprofit contract, but they're frustrated that the city doesn't feel responsive or efficient. They wait a long time on a 911 call. They look at the worn out street in front of their house. They try to pull a permit for a home remodel and it drags on for months.
Mm.
And some of that traces back to the same budget math we've been talking about. When the city is short on officers, the mayor herself has said it means longer emergency response times. You can see it in the surveys, too. In polling done for one recent report, a majority of Oakland voters said that they shop or dine in other cities because they feel safer there. Almost 2/3 of downtown workers said crime keeps them from coming in person.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't just a few wealthy homeowners grumbling. It's widespread, and it costs the city economically.
Although I just want to be fair here, some of those expectations just may be more than a city like Oakland can realistically, consistently meet. Oakland is big. It is diverse. It is genuinely faced with more complicated socioeconomic challenges, right? The kind of seamless concierge level service that you might get in a small, wealthy suburb just may not be on the table here, at least not every single time you go to reach for it. And I think it's also worth saying that Oakland's problems get talked about far more than its strengths. Our culture, our food, our people, our nature, our art, all the stuff that we also try and report on more, I think it's fair to say, than any other local news outlet. The fact is that for all of its dysfunction, this city does offer amazing things every day to a lot of people,
including people who have no chance of making any kind of life in, say, a wealthier community that has no interest in their belonging there.
Yeah.
Oakland values being a place that genuinely works for people with wildly different life experiences and advantages, or at least tries to work for them in ways that you simply don't see everywhere in the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Now, of course, we know that none of that makes the widespread frustration illegitimate. People across Oakland, well off, struggling, have something real to be frustrated about. Now, what I hear you guys saying is they're frustrated about some of the same things, but also many different things, and they don't all have the same ability to absorb it. Before we wrap, I want to question some of the ways that we talk about this issue. I know I am one of those people that is guilty of throwing around terms like fiscal cliff in everyday conversation in our newsroom. And I'm really questioning that metaphor. A cliff is a single edge. You go over it once and it's over. That is not what Oakland's financial problem actually looks like, as I've learned from your reporting. Maybe it's more helpful to picture a patchwork quilt that is fraying. The quilt still covers the bed, but it's got a bunch of holes in it, and some of those holes haven't been fixed in a long time. And some are newer and smaller, but getting bigger. And we all know that that can't last forever. So what would it actually take to break the cycle? What are you two watching for in the months ahead in your own reporting as you think about the health of our city, the health of that quilt?
Honestly, the unglamorous stuff, like whether the city gets serious about collecting money it's already owed, that's a big one. An audit found Oakland may have left tens of millions of dollars in business taxes uncollected during the worst of the crises.
Yeah.
Whether they get police overtime under control, which has run tens of millions of dollars over budget, that's another one. And whether they stop balancing budgets on one-time money that may never arrive.
Yeah.
And I'd watch who keeps absorbing the cuts. Because if one of the city's strategies for surviving these crises is to trim from nonprofits and neighborhood programs, the damage is real, even if it never shows up as a single dramatic moment of collapse. It just accumulates quietly in the parts of Oakland that have the least.
So, maybe the better question really isn't whether Oakland goes over the cliff. It's how thin the quilt gets and who is left sitting under the holes. Eli, Natalie, thank you. This is the kind of story that just doesn't fit in a single headline, and I really appreciate you both helping to untangle it over many years now.
Thanks, Tasneem.
Thanks.
We will link to all of Natalie and Eli's reporting on this issue going back several years in the show notes. Follow the Oakland Side's daily newsletters if you want to get their reporting in your inbox. That's this week's episode of Oakland Side 510. Sorry, no headlines today, with so much to cover on Oakland's finances. You can find all the stories we talked about and all of our other recent reporting at oaklandside.org. If you haven't already, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We love reading those. This episode was produced by Mark Nieto and hosted by me, Tasneem Raja. On behalf of our entire newsroom, thank you for showing up for Oakland. We'll see you next week.